welcome to the 100th episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm joined as always by Richard. Good to have you with us,
It's good
Richard.
to be with you, Sam, live and on video.
Exactly. We had a bit of a technical difficulty in the beginning, but I think we've got it figured out now. I'll look back at our technical guru, making sure everything's...
Who's in charge of that anyway?
Yeah, exactly. He's fired. So a couple quick things we want to mention. We are giving away the Spiritual Leadership, or a copy of Spiritual Leadership, which is a book that Richard wrote with his dad several years ago, and it's really kind of been an impetus for this podcast and for a lot of what you do on leadership comes out of there. So it's a great book. Leave us a comment, and we will pick from the comments one lucky winner that is in the U.S., and we'll mail that out to you as soon as possible. Maybe even get Richard to sign it for you. We'll see if we can twist his arm. The other thing that I'll mention before we get started is questions. Yes, that's a good one. Because if you're listening to this on Tuesday morning, sorry you can't write your questions in live. This will just be a recording. But if you're watching right now, send us your questions. We'll try and answer those live if we have time, and as we go. And we just love to hear from you. Send us your comments, send us your questions, and we'll answer those as we go through. But today we're looking at the 5 viewpoints of leaders. And Richard, this is a blog actually that you wrote a few weeks ago, and I thought this would be a good time to sort of unpack that a little bit more.
Sure.
And tell us just sort of some of those insights that you've found on leadership through the years.
And I do have a blog site that I put blogs on that we'll put in the show notes if you'd like to read the whole blog or other leadership blogs as well.
If you're into that sort of thing.
But this is a leadership podcast, and we've been trying to address leadership issues, as you know, if you've been listening in. And I thought it would be an interesting discussion here in our 100th podcast to talk about the 5 viewpoints of leaders, because I think that the way that leaders view things is different than the way other people see things. And in some ways, that's almost like their superpower. A leader walks in on the shop floor or walks into the office, and they see things that other people would walk right by and not even notice. And I remember when I first became the president of a seminary, I arrived at the very beginning of August. It's kind of the dead time of the year. Classes will be beginning about a month later. And people had been on vacation and working on various projects and so on. And so I arrive, and I'm not trying to find anything wrong. I'm not trying to check up on anybody's work. I'm just walking around, just kind of seeing the lay of the land as the new boss on the premises. Right. And I get there, and I get to the parking lot, and there's these like 3-foot-high thistle bushes that are just overtaking the edge of the parking lot. And there's all kinds of big weeds growing and thriving up against the edges of the sides of the buildings, and it just looks hideous. And there were maintenance people that were hired by the seminary to take care of things, but none of them had an eye for aesthetics. They had an eye for fixing tractor engines, and so they would happily work all day on tractor engines and those kinds of repairs, which needed to be done. But they wouldn't even notice the fact that the place was being overrun with weeds and unattractive garbage collecting against the sides of the building. And, of course, the school has got people coming to visit to decide if they want to be a student there or not, and they're coming on this property and being very underimpressed with what the appearance of the place. And so I remember walking in and just thinking to myself and starting to ask some of the staff, like, how could you just walk right by this day after day? How could you not want to fix this or clean this up? And
you're starting to sound like my wife.
Yeah. We won't go there because we're on camera here.
Yeah.
But what I realized was when you're a leader, you can't afford to just walk right by stuff and not notice things. And it's really kind of your job to see things that perhaps other people, they're in their silo. They're working away on their very specific projects, and they don't necessarily see the big picture like the leader has to. So I just realized that there were at least 5 perspectives that a leader had to have. 5 different pairs of glasses, if you will, that a leader needs to put on at various times in their leadership. And so I thought we'd just walk through those in the next few moments, and perhaps it'll spark some questions that people watching in today would like to submit. The first perspective is I just call the 30,000-foot view. And, of course, that's referring to the view from the air. When you're on an airplane looking down from 30,000 feet, you see the big picture.
Right.
You see how things are in relationship to one another. For 5 years, I lived in Greenville, South Carolina. Beautiful city. It was a beautiful place to live. And I flew in and out of a regional airport. And I actually just lived about 6 miles from the airport. And so when I would be coming into land or taking off, I'd be flying right over my neighborhood and the parks in the area and the schools in the area, the shopping centers. And every time I'd be coming in, I'd be looking out the window and getting perspective. And I'd realize, wait a minute, I could get to the airport faster if I didn't know that there was that back road there.
Yeah.
I didn't see that till I was up in the air looking down, and that looks like a really nice park. I had no idea it was so close to where I live, and I realized, wow, look at all the traffic on that road. At rush hour, I can see how I could avoid that if I went this way. And just getting up high and looking down, you see things differently than when you're on the ground driving down those same roads. And a leader has got to do that. Now, other people who are maybe in charge of fixing tractor engines, they don't necessarily have to get up 30,000 feet and see how they're fixing this tractor affects the bottom line and the fundraising campaigns and the student enlistment campaigns or whatever else. They just want to get this engine fixed. But somebody has to see how fixing this engine also links with staffing issues over here and building a new building over there and all the other different issues related. I remember at one point when I was a seminary president, we built a second building, a primary building, and so we more than doubled our building space, and we put all of our academic people into one building, and we put all the administrative people in another building. And we put a causeway. The 2 buildings were physically connected. You never had to go outside to get from one to the other. But I'll tell you what, it's true. I think it was maybe Winston Churchill who said our architecture determines our culture. And the kind of buildings you build, whether it's up high and you've got the top execs in the very top floor, or you have separate buildings, some with a nice view of the mountains and others of the parking lot. Yeah. It changes culture. And all of a sudden I begin to hear people talking about how, well, we don't know what goes on in that building over there. We don't know what you're doing. And it's like, well, you could walk here in 2 minutes, but why don't you know? And you got 2 different cultures, 2 different approaches to things. And I began to realize I've got good people, but they're just by separation of 2 buildings, I've got 2 different cultures developing, and I've got to be above that. I've got to see both buildings, how everything's connected, and hold it all together. And so just a word to leaders, there are times where you've got to step back from the day-to-day grind, and you got to get up higher and look down and say, how do all these different departments and staff and personnel and projects, how do they all fit together into one whole?
Yeah, and I think, something along with that is actually making the time to take that step back.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people can, myself included, is you get so busy doing and in that grind that it, well, we don't have time to really think, is this the right direction overall, because we've got to meet these deadlines and so forth. And so I think making the time to do that is key, really.
Yeah, and I think that's what happens a lot of times, is that the urgent constantly pulls us back into just specifics and certain details, and we don't have that time just to pull away and then just see the whole picture unfold in front of us. And someone's got to have the big picture, and that has to be the leader. Yeah. Who, when people come and say, well, why are we doing this? Why do we even care about that? Well, let me tell you the big picture. at the seminary, we had people during the summer that would plant flower beds. We had a greenhouse where all these flowers are getting prepared ahead of time. And sometimes people could say, well, why do we do this? Why are we out here digging all these flowers into the ground and so on? But I would say, but you don't know the enlistment office that takes prospective students through. And when they walk by and see all these beautiful flower beds, it looks so attractive, and it makes our school look so appealing. Or donors who come and they see how well we take care of this place. And you're just worried about keeping these flowers surviving these late frosts. But I know the enlistment people, I know the donor people, and I know that these flowers over here are tied into everything else we're doing, and they have an important role. And so the leader's got to know how everything fits together, and that comes from backing up and looking down.
But that's not the only thing the leader has to know.
No, wait, there's more. Not only do you have the 30,000-foot view, but you also, I say you have to have a future view. That is, you can't just look at the organization in terms of what's happening today. Every time you look at the organization, you also have to have the future in the backdrop. Not just where are we today, but where are we going? And if we keep doing this activity day after day, where will that take us? One day we're going to get up in the morning and realize we've arrived somewhere. Well, if we'd been paying attention, if we'd had a future view, we would have known where we were going to arrive. Scripture says in Galatians chapter 5 that you will reap what you sow. And so if day after day you keep sowing one thing, you can't be surprised when you reap the same thing. And that's what leaders do. And again, there's a lot of people that all they care about is today. I just want to be happy today. You see this in churches a lot. You may have an aging congregation that says, well, we just like singing the hymns. We just like singing the music we grew up with. Why can't we just do that? And so if you're a leader who is not future-oriented, you might just say, well, okay, the important thing is to keep my people happy, so we'll keep singing what they like. We won't change anything that they don't want to change. We'll just keep it the same way it was when they were growing up and going to church in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Well, that keeps everything fine today. But if you're future-oriented, you realize, wait a minute, everybody who's coming to our church services is gray or white-haired or no-haired. But where is this going to take us? If we don't reach now, right now we still have we're about half full auditorium, a third full. We can still pay our bills, so it's not pressing, it's not a crisis, but the trends, the trajectory suggests that 5, 6, 10 years later, we're going to be so small and so old and such debt at this point that it'll be too late for us. So leaders have got to always be looking ahead, and you'll always have naysayers who will say, but we like it this way. Well, that's great, but you won't like it this way when there's only you and half a dozen people left, because we didn't make any changes to adjust to the future. And so leaders are always kind of looking ahead to say, well, yeah, this activity right now is okay, but if we keep doing this activity, where will it take us? What will the result be down the road because we just kept doing this same activity?
Well, that's great. That's not all you have.
Yeah, there's more still. So the third one, and this is a little bit controversial actually, it's called leaders have to have an organizational view. That is, they've got to be looking at the organization itself to realize how do we keep this healthy? How do we keep it strong? And I'll tell you, sometimes what happens is, and we're going to get to talking about people here next, but sometimes we could be so focused on keeping people happy that we create a weak organization, an organization that is getting out of date, that is financially getting into trouble, that's losing its vitality. And I know organizations that try really hard, for instance, to take really good care of their people. And so I'm going to give you a real practical example. I know organizations that every year they will just automatically give you a cost of living increase in your wages. Now, you may not have necessarily done a good job. It's not because you're just getting rewarded for good service.
You kept that seat for one more year.
You were there a whole year, so we're going to give you a 5% increase in your wages. Well, so you've got staff maybe in the clerical pool, the office staff, and now they've been there for 30 years, 35, 40 years. And they're getting quite dated now. They can't handle the new software programs. But they've gotten these increases year by year, and now they're being way overpaid for what they actually do. They're being paid a huge salary because they've been there a long time, not because they bring the most value to an organization. And many of you, I'm sure, have been in that place. Maybe it's the church secretary who's been there 40 years, and a lovely woman, great prayer warrior, but it's just easier now for you just to do the work yourself than to try to get her to figure this out on the internet. And it's just beyond her. But she's got an increase in pay for 40 years in a row, and now she's getting paid about as much as the pastor is. And you can't afford to hire a younger, more gifted person that's up to speed on software programs, because you pay so much money into someone who's not doing a very good job anymore. And of course, with COVID-19 taking place, there are a lot of organizations that wrestled with this to say, well, we've got to take care of our people. We've got to keep our people on. We don't want to lose any of our people, which is all noble. But if you go bankrupt as an organization because you paid so much and you were so generous, then everybody is unemployed. Now, nobody has an income, including you. And so sometimes we can be so focused on people and being generous and blessing our people and giving this away free and giving this away free and raising everybody's pay and paying way above the going rate, that one day we realize we can't afford to make payroll anymore. We've got too many high-priced people that are not producing at the level we're paying. And what's happened is you have focused on your people, but you've neglected the organization. And now you've got an organization rife with practices and expenses and obligations that you can't meet. It's not practical. And so the leader, of course, there's always people that are going to come and say, well, could we just buy this? Could we just give this? This guy could really use the encouragement. Let's give him a promotion. But the leader's got to look at the whole organization to say, but if we keep doing this, 5 years from now, where will we have such a huge payroll that we just can't meet it anymore? And I had a guy one time come to me, and he wanted to buy a new tractor for the seminary, and just think what this could do, and it'd be so much easier and faster and more efficient and less breakdowns. And well, how much will it cost? Well, it was a lot of money. And it's like, well, you have a tractor, doesn't it get the job done? Yeah, but it would be so much nicer in this tractor. And their attitude was kind of like, if as the president you just agree to spend the money, they don't have to worry about where the money comes from. They don't have to worry about the fact that you have no money now for marketing, or you have no money to improve the student housing or other things, because all they care about is they got what they wanted. Yeah. And of course, when you've got an organization filled with people who all want what they want for their job in their area, again, they need someone who sees the whole organization and says, well, I want to give you what you really need, but I've got to weigh all of the needs of this organization and make sure that I don't get so over leaning in one direction that this part of the organization is hurting terribly.
Well, and I imagine too that with anything in leadership, there's a balance there.
Yeah.
Because if you're too organizational focused, then you do end up treating your people as just, widgets in a machine.
Right.
And when it stops working, you replace it with something else, like you would parts on a tractor.
Yeah.
So I guess is striking that balance, I would say, seems to be pretty important, so that you're not just sort of coddling your people, but you're also not, being a taskmaster necessarily.
Right. Right. And that's why, the fourth one is to have a people view, which is you do focus on people as well. You have to see them. And successful leaders tend to be people that have their pulse beat of the people. They know successful leaders get the best out of their people. They get a lot of performance out of a lot of results. But they also know when they pushed as hard as they can. They know when their people need to catch their breath, when they need a break. And I would say, and this sounds really harsh and sounds almost Scrooge-like, but most organizations do not exist for the staff. You don't set up an organization to say, okay, now we can employ all these staff and pay them well. You set up organizations, companies that have a mission, have a purpose. If it's a company for profit, it's profits. The people that invest their money want profits to come back out. They're happy to take care of the people, the staff, but it doesn't exist for the staff. Sometimes churches can do that. Churches think that the church exists for the people instead of to reach the people, to serve God, to be on mission with God. It's like, no, this is our church, so it's about us and just what will make us happy. But I would say, no, organizations have a purpose. They have a mission. And as a leader, you want to, you say we hire people, we enlist volunteers to accomplish a mission. But the people aren't the mission. The staff are not the mission. They accomplish the mission. So that's why I say you have to make sure the organization is healthy to accomplish the mission.
Right.
But at the same time, you also do have to have an eye on the people, because if your people are all burning out and quitting and underperforming, then the wheels are going to come off and you're never going to achieve the mission.
Exactly.
So you got to have an eye on people as well. And sometimes, and there's the balance. Sometimes people are so people oriented that the leader's got to say, yeah, but what about the organization? Sometimes you've got people that are all like, we got to push and push and push, and we got to get all this stuff done. And then the leader's got to come back and say, yeah, but I see people are burning out. I see people getting really short with each other in the staff meetings. We're getting a lot of sickness and illnesses right now. I just feel like people are being worn out. And so then a leader comes back and says, well, then let's ease off the gas pedal here. Why don't we give a bone? Let's do something. I remember when I was running a school at a certain point, just realizing we had gone through a whole accreditation process, and people have been working really hard, and we were recruiting students and building buildings, and we got to the end of the year, and I kind of looked to see what we could afford as far as a bonus. We didn't have a lot of money left over. We'd spent a lot of money that year on the organization, but I just said, we could write people a check, but I'd love just to do something really special for these folks that they wouldn't normally get to do. And so we put a bunch of money in. I personally put a bunch of money in, and we took all the staff to a beautiful hotel up in Banff in the Rocky Mountains, and we had a really, really wonderful time up there, and had special entertainment. Everybody was laughing and just having a great time. We had gifts for everybody. And it was just very, very memorable. And everybody just felt like, as tiring and exhausting as that year was, what a great way to end the year. And we were laughing, we're celebrating, God's been good. But as a leader, you're sort of watching that to say, are we taking care of our people? If we can pay more, if we can provide a benefit, we ought to.
Yeah. But that's not the only way to take care of your people. It's strictly salary.
Well, and I think sometimes, you can kind of get into that trap where it's all it is about money. And it's like,
Right.
Well, everybody kind of lives for the year-end bonus or the year-end increase in pay. And I think it becomes just very mechanical. And if that's all you're doing, then they're going to be looking around all the time to say, well, who will pay me more? There's got to be more to it. A genuine concern for your people and their well-being, the work environment. There's a lot to it. When you see people just barking at each other, snapping at each other, a leader intervenes and says, okay, I don't like where this is going. I don't like the culture. If you're a pastor of a church and you've got a bunch of bickering in a business meeting, or you've got a bunch of people complaining and criticizing, you've got to step in and say, I'm concerned about where the people are right now. And as a leader, it's up to me to address that and help the people catch a vision, maybe just spend some time with some of the complainers and listen to what they're concerned about. But I've got to address this and not let it fester and be unattended.
Yeah, well, if you're just joining us, this is the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. We're live on YouTube. our first ever, and we're just so happy to have you with us.
Yeah.
And before we wrap up here, we've got one more point of view that a leader should have. If you're listening to this on Tuesday morning when it normally comes out, we'll maybe try and do this again, and hopefully you can join us then as well. And so, Richard, before we wrap up here, what is the last viewpoint of a leader?
Well, that's why I just describe it, heaven's view or God's view, and that is, do you see things the way God does? Do you see your organization the way God sees it? Sometimes we can just wade in with all the busyness and activity, and we don't stop to say, but how does God view this? I've known even sometimes churches that might perhaps build a new building, and they thought, wow, God must really be pleased with us. We've just built this brand new facility. We've got it 2/3 paid for already. It's the biggest auditorium on this side of the river in our city, and just think how much glory to God it brings. And yet there's been all kinds of fighting and bickering and hurt feelings, and a third of your church members have actually left the church because they've been so upset at the process. And a leader's got to look at that and say, well, yeah, the building got built, but I don't think that we honored God the way we did it.
Right.
There's a way to do things that brings glory to God as well. And a leader's got to look at that and say, yeah, we may be getting these results, but does that please God? Is that what God focuses on? And sometimes it's the way people are interacting with one another. And sometimes it's just about being God-focused as an organization, especially if you're a church or you're a Christian nonprofit. You've got to be asking your people and talking about, well, what God is doing. My dad, when he wrote Experiencing God, was always saying, even Christians oftentimes are not God-focused. They're self-centered. They're talking about, well, what can we afford? What do we like? What do we want? But not what does God want? What pleases God? What's he doing? What's he trying to accomplish? And that's a world of difference. And so a leader does not just take a poll. In fact, I've often said in this podcast, if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer.
Yeah.
And so when a leader asks people, well, what do you think? Or what would you like to see? What do you think we should do? That oftentimes is the wrong question. The right question, certainly in a Christian organization, would be, as you've been praying and seeking God's direction, what do you sense God wants us to do? Where do you sense God is leading us? That's a whole different perspective. And you'll always have people in the organization who say, well, I just think, and as a leader, sometimes you have to stop and say, well, that's not the question I asked. I didn't ask what you thought. I asked, what do you sense God thinks about this? And I'll tell you what, even in a church, you'll have to work to get it God-centered instead of self-centered. There are people in the church who really honestly behave as if it's kind of their own private country club, and they get to have it be the way they want it to be. And instead of saying, no, this is a divine institution bought and paid for by God, and he has a right to make it do whatever he wants it to do, whether we like it or not. And so sometimes as a leader, you've got to push back to say, I just don't feel like maybe it's a publicly traded company and our shareholders are delighted with our profits. But I tell you what, some of the corners we've been cutting, some of the lies we've been telling, some of the lack of follow through, keeping our word, I just have to sense God's not pleased with that. And we need to behave with more integrity. And so sometimes even in a publicly traded company, it's still a great question to ask, is God pleased with how we're running this business and the way we're treating employees and the way we treat our customers, the quality of product that we're selling to people? Are we following through with the way we're advertising this? And certainly when God is pleased with your company, with your church, with your organization, then you want the blessing of God upon whatever it is that you lead. And ultimately that's up to the leader to put those God glasses on to say, well, from my perspective, things look pretty nice, but I start to look at this same organization the way God would look at it, with what he values. and I begin to feel a little uncomfortable, like I'm not sure he's as happy with this as I was.
Yeah, well, these are just some fantastic reminders for any leader. The way that you view your organization, the way that you view what it is that you do, thinking about the organization, but also the people, thinking about the future, looking at the big picture, and ultimately seeing things from heaven's perspective. I think it's just a great reminder for all of us. And Richard, you wrote this blog at richardblackaby.com. You can find it there if you want to just read a more in-depth analysis. And Richard, you've written many other things on the blog as well. You do some book reviews on there also. And so I encourage you to check out richardblackaby.com for more thoughts on leadership and book reviews on leadership as well. And thanks for joining us for the first ever Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast live stream. And for the 100th episode.
Yeah, and thank you for listening in on our podcasts week by week. We love hearing feedback from folks. I'm constantly getting emails from people or LinkedIn messages just saying, I love the podcast. And we always love to hear from folks. And love it when people will email, message us, and just submit a question. Say, sometime I'd love for just to hear your thoughts on this issue, and we'll try to get to those as much as we can.
Yeah, we do as much as we can, and ratings and reviews are helpful for us.
Yeah.
It's sort of how you can thank us for what we're doing, and even though there's not a whole lot of back and forth necessarily on the traditional podcast, but it's a way to help us continue to do what we do. And so with that, we'll sign off, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
See you then.